Perfect. Okay. Hello, welcome, Nick.
Hey, happy
We're
to be here.
just amazing. I think Brian connected you. So I've just hit the record button and we're about to get started. So welcome to the Emerging Code Licensing Talk, March 2022. My name is Boris. I'm the founder and CEO of Fission, which is working on the future of computing. So we build a lot of tools to do peer-to-peer data and identity and compute. And pretty much all of the code that we create is open source. And I have a long open source background going back to early participation in the Drupal open source CMS, which I got involved in way back in 2003. So back when open source was a small movement that was highly was still a radical act. Let's put it that way. Nick, I know you got invited in, and you have some active points of discussion around this very topic. So, would you be comfortable introducing yourself and saying what you're hoping to learn or talk about on this call?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah, my name is Nick Thompson. I work in the computer music audio software space. I have a project that I'm focusing on right now called Elementary Audio, which is primarily a software framework for people who are interested in writing audio applications, whether they're in the browser, at the command line, on an embedded chip, or an audio plugin running inside of some music software. The reason I'm here, the reason I'm listening in is basically because the project currently is closed source, as sort of with the primary motivation being that I don't quite understand or see a path for a viable, sustainable business model if the code is open source. And so I have been looking for ways basically to build the business around the software. And I'm eager to learn, really. I'm not terribly well versed in this space. I'm much more of an engineer than a legal licensing person. And ideally, there's a model here that lets me both open source the framework and develop a revenue stream that is strong enough, even just to keep me working on it full time into the foreseeable future. That's that's what I'm here to learn, basically.
Great. And Eduardo, I'll invite you to say the same thing. Do you want to introduce yourself and your project for the record?
Sure, thank you. So my name is Eduardo. I am an amateur programming language designer and developer trying to go professional. I've been working on a programming language since late 2014. It has always been open source to some extent, in large part because I believe that if people are going to be building software on top of my technology, they should have visibility. I am not comfortable on ethical grounds on closed source. However, after coming to the realization that the mythology of open source, that we're all a community and we're all working together and this is all a collective effort, doesn't actually happen in the real world in most instances. And instead you just end up being a sole maintainer, doing everything, and everybody's just kind of getting value out of your work without putting something back. I kind of became disenchanted with open source, and I'm looking for a post open source alternative where I can keep the good things of open source, people being able to rely on my software because they can see what's going on, but I can avoid ideally the triad of the commons problem that is very pervasive in open source. I'm very interested in this world of emerging code licensing and post open source and all of that. I've been interested in that for years. However, because I'm so focused on just working on my language right now, I cannot necessarily dedicate as much effort as I wish to. So instead, I'm kind of a lurker, I kind of participate in conversations, hoping to maybe one day after I'm done with the bulk of my work on my language, I can maybe do a more serious effort to contribute. But in the meantime, you can count on me at least for moral support.
Amazing. That's great. And I think you touched on two terms that I want to dig in a little later, Tragedy Commons and post open source. So thank you very much for introducing that. Okay, I'm going to start going through this deck. Please go ahead and unmute yourself or chat with a comment whenever you like. This, has some information. We'll post it afterwards. There's links to lots of different licenses, but please just to pipe in. I know a lot of people on this call have lots of experiences and thoughts on open source. So this is just an excuse to gather some of this information together. So I always like to, and with Eduardo mentioning post open source, I very much feel that is a thing. Their open source was the non-default in the early 2000s, and it was a bunch of weirdos running Linux and talking about how code should be open. In many ways, in 2022, it's in fact the default. But the default in a way that a lot of, especially new software engineers, don't think about it at all and have not grappled with any of it for the most part. So for me, I actually think that it's not just licensing. There's this phrase open source community, right? There's a lot of different stuff in there. And so this is the definition that I use. So I think an open source in part means the legal innovation of licenses. So copyleft is one phrase to opposed to copyright, to essentially use the tools of copyright in an innovative way to lock code open in certain ways. But law itself is an incredible toolkit that you can do very, very interesting things with. Number two, the shorthand I believe that people use when they say open source means this. Oh yeah, a bunch of people work on code together. And what's interesting, of course, is there's this emerging term, inner source, which means basically working like an open source community, but inside a company. And really, as an example, the entire Fission team, which is remote first, well, we work together on code collaboratively, asynchronously, and remotely. That also, in many cases, happens to have an open source license. And then lastly, I think that we have to say that open source is an ideology in many ways, or a set of beliefs around code reuse and sharing, and it's adjacent to, I think, things like open data. And I think from my point of view, part of that relation is an understanding that with digital, we don't really have scarcity. Right? A bit, you can make a copy, you can right click and save something, and it's fine. It didn't cost anybody anything. So why shouldn't you just quote unquote share it freely? Free. So open source, when you say free, there is free as in speech, meaning a license or an ideology that says it enshrines the freedom to be able to use and reuse it. It doesn't mean no cost. And free as in puppies, the funny joke there is, congratulations, you decided to take some open source code as a dependency. All bets are off. It's up to you to maintain it, improve it, and anything else that might go wrong with it, right? A puppy may not cost you anything, but you immediately are on the hook for vet bills and training and everything else like that. So what I've really noticed in the last 2, 3, 4 years is what I'm calling licensing innovation. And I can make a bombastic statement like for the first time in 15 years. It's been a while since the first wave. And what I am seeing, I'm seeing interest, I'm seeing renewed discussion from a number of people in a number of corners around licensing innovation. So non-commercial is one that I'm personally very interested in, the Prosperity license, the Big Time license, Fair Source. There's a set of ethical licenses where people are exploring what it means to bake ethics into a license. I'd say that one's highly controversial. It's not any, I'm not referring to any particular one in that case, just a broad class of ones. 996 ICU is one that's come out of China that I think is very interesting, that I would call an ethical license in many ways, and a ton more. So why is this happening? Is I think the other question, and both Nick and Eduardo pointed to certain things around that were actually both related to business models in different ways. How do we choose a license? What are the reasons to choose an open source license? You know, Eduardo mentioned that he's like, well, I'm creating a programming language and I kind of think if people are going to build other apps on top of it, that the expectation is that a programming language should be open source. And so that I think, Eduardo, you're really saying your hypothesis is if it's not some flavor of open source, then people won't use it. So that is that fair to say?
I would say there are two elements to that. There is definitely the element of it's not open source, people want to use it, but I don't think that one is so strong, because I think that when people don't use something because it's not open source, I think it is less about the openness and it's mostly about the price tag, because there are programming languages out there that are not open source and people use them. But I think it's more of a situation of at some point somebody saw enough value to use it, and then a particular sector of the industry continued to use it, and they don't particularly care about the fact that it's not open source. It's just part of the daily work. But when you try to sell it to someone else that is not already a user, then now you have to justify it. But I think for them, it's mostly a problem of they don't want to pay. It's not so much a problem of I want to see the source code. But with that said, for me personally, there's a secondary aspect of it's less that I think I have to make it open source because that's expectation. It's more like I think for ethical reasons, I should make it open source. Not that I should make it open source. I should make it, people should be able to see the code. I want it to be quote unquote post open source. But people should be able
source
to see
available.
Yes, because for me, it's a matter of if people cannot see how the sausage is made, they are in a position of vulnerability, whether they realize it or not. Because what happens if there is a bug in my code that now their code base inherits, and they have no way of even knowing it? What happens, you know, God forbid, what happens if I, or quote unquote, some contributor introduces malicious code into my code base? They don't know. All they have is my verbal assurance that everything is fine and the code is going to work fine. I think that puts anybody who uses any closed source programming language in particular in a position of vulnerability. And I think that telling my users it's fine, trust me, is somewhat irresponsible. So I basically want to have my cake and eat it too. I want to have the transparency, but I don't want to have the problems in terms of business models that has so far entailed for open source projects.
Right. Welcome, Danny.
Okay.
I think that's a really good point, Eduardo, that essentially, so let me summarize. So basically, your point of view is that, especially for something like a programming language, that source available is the right ethical choice, because just trust me is really not getting a lot of mileage these days. Yeah. So I think that's I would say that's an emerging trend where people are almost they really don't know what license to pick, but they feel very strongly that at the very least it should be source available for inspection. Is that a fair statement? Like I have some other examples in the wild right now.
Yeah.
It definitely my personal feeling as well, where I want to have the option of some of the stuff and know what's going on. It was Jeff Litt who creates the Twemex app, which is a Chrome extension that kind of enhances your usage of Twitter. I had a great discussion with him, and he's thinking about some of the same things where, Chrome extensions can kind of do a lot. They can watch all your activity and everything else like that. So he also felt like he wanted to make source available so that other people could inspect it. But he didn't necessarily want someone else to publish an alternate Chrome extension with the same source code, right? If a tinkerer wanted to, a developer wanted to make their own version and run it like just for themselves, that was fine. But his thinking was like, he didn't really want user confusion or like someone running a scam or other things like that. And so, part of that discussion is like, what license do I pick? Which, of course, the flip side of this is if someone wants to run a scam, probably the license you pick doesn't matter. Any other thoughts on why you might pick a license? Nick, it sounded like you really want a business model tool.
Yeah, and I think the way that Eduardo just basically the synopsis that Eduardo just gave, I think is really accurate. I mean, I would say that the way he put it resonated very well with me. And my preference would be to open source, but my feeling around that as well is that there's, I guess I wonder if open source over the past decade or so has kind of like built this expectation for software to be free, and free as in like cost free. We've seen, I don't know how many stories about open source maintainers who have a project that goes, reasonably successful, who then have to like tap out of writing software in public altogether because the burden is just too much and they're not being compensated for it in a sustainable way. And so there's to me, there's very much this question around open source versus sustainable revenue models. And I guess my read on the scene is that those open source projects that become majorly successful, that stick around for many, many years, are those that are basically backed by huge corporations that can afford to just staff a team on the open source project. And so, yeah, I feel like these things are very intertwined for kind of the indie developer or the small team organizations that are trying to explore open source software in a sustainable, with a sustainable business model, if that makes sense.
I think you actually, I think a lot of these things, this both expectation, like that's very much what I'm seeing. We've teleported forward 2 decades, and yeah, software is open source, asterisks, but mostly people are paid full-time by Facebook to work on React. Which I'm like, wait, what? As an example. I think from an ideology perspective, my perspective was never that the outcome would be, my take is full corporate capture of the concept of open source essentially, that we are at today, and that maintainers are somewhat forced to build. This is awkward phrasing. Forced to build a business is one angle. The other thing is literally as a tool where no one but your company can easily commercialize it, which also was not the intent of open source licensing. I'd say was in the past tense in some way, but it gets used very effectively in things like dual licensing and copyright ownership. Quinn had a question. Brooke and I have looked at this a little bit, and we've talked about Apache versus MIT, and our preference is, although not super strongly held, is Apache, because Apache includes some patent covenants by default, and essentially meaning that as part of the Apache license, if someone patents something that they have previously contributed under open source, they lose access to the and they use that patent aggressively, then they lose access to the entire software license. And so that's it again. This is the sort of game of giants of big companies, and MIT is a lot looser, which is like, good luck, do what you like. I'm going to keep flipping through some licenses because I think we're heading in an interesting direction here, especially the whole business model. Yeah, Brooke says MIT is freer. I think more permissive is the phrasing. I wanted to specifically, so a lot of these references, I should say this, and I've put it in the link, so we'll follow up again. I've learned a ton from Kyle Mitchell, who is a dual class lawyer, software engineer based in Oakland, who writes and maintains a ton of open source licenses. And, oh, sorry, I already made the mistake. A variety of software licenses. This is the one in his License Zero project that really opened my eyes that there were some other directions that could be done. His original License Zero project was some automation around doing sort of dual licensing, where there was some free and open usage, and then there were various reasons that you would trigger a paid license. So Prosperity is the one that to me is more interesting. And it's essentially says it's non-commercial software. So if you as an individual, a nonprofit, etc., use the software, it is available at no charge with all of the share alike principles and source available that one expects from classic open source. I'm really we're overloading the term open source at this point, so feel free to stop me. I literally am having trouble of how we talk about these things. But if you use the software to make money, not only is there an expectation that you should pay, but literally a license that says you need to pay for a commercial license if you are an entity that makes money. Not only if you make money from the software, but if you are a commercial business that makes money, that earns revenue, then really you should be giving back in paying for a license to support the further development of it. Is that a decent description? And does anyone have any questions about that?
I have a quick question on that. I've explored these types of licenses before, or when I say explored, I should say I've thought about them. And I've read a bunch of Kyle Mitchell's work as well, which is kind of how I don't know, arrived at this way of thinking. And a question that I got often from users of my software as I was exploring this was basically, well, I want to use your software commercially, but I am not a commercial entity yet. When do I have to start paying?
I think this is a really interesting thing. Like ultimately, you are still a real person, a vendor, someone who can have a discussion with that, and you get to decide, including you can give people licenses at no charge whenever you like. But I think that's also very unique to each piece of software as well. And it says like, great, is your concern that you can't afford this? So basically, Nick, I think that's the exact point that we as maintainers should use as an opportunity for what we wouldn't say in business or product, customer discovery. Like, let's dig in and understand what the actual concern of that person is. If they've currently made $0 off of their software, you might say, no problem, right? Go ahead and start paying me when you make your first sale, as an example. I think probably the nuance there is you, Nick, have to decide what you're going to charge to give the other person surety that they can build a business, right? Like, obviously, if it's a surprise where it's like, oh, the license is $10,000. And I think that also gets a bunch of things, right? Should Facebook pay the same amount for a license as a one-person software shop? Probably not.
Don't some of the Kyle Mitchell's licenses have like a kind of a grace period where if you come into breach of the contract, that you have so many days, within which to comply, and maybe that kind of.
I think this is less about compliance. Like those need to be in there, and they need to be in there for good and legal reasons. I don't think like this is a discussion with people of an understanding that Nick software has value. Like, if the person literally intends to make a commercial business and they want to pay, and their question all of a sudden is, when do I need to pay? That's not that's an amazing discussion to have that I don't think is needs to be plugged with a legal recourse, I think.
Yeah, I was just thinking that the grace period kind of implies like a time period of like while you started making money, like.
I think the intent is in this particular case, which is you're inside Giant Co, and you have 30 days to start, to figure stuff out, which is not really the same thing as a single individual. And I think that's the hard part about these licenses, trying to capture both. Recently from Kyle, I would say this is another non-commercial license. He calls it the big time license. And this solves the problem of small versus large. So basically, small businesses, including single individuals, can go ahead and use software at no charge. And the expectation is that big businesses have paid licenses. So he's got a recent release, a thread on Hacker News. Some of this was a discussion around what is the definition of big business, how much money is the company making, how many people work there, those other sorts of, how much funding does the company have. So definitely another super interesting one where, speaking of customers, you as a software maintainer would only end up talking to larger entities about paid licensing. And I'm going to flip through these, like, basically, unless people have questions, I'm going to flick through some of these. I just wanted to put them in the slide deck so that I had links to all of these things. Fair source. There's some nuance here where I have a slide about this as well, where there's basically an argument where people point fingers and say, you can't call that open source because there's a definition. And if we change the definition of open source, society will crumble. 30 old white men designed the license in 2007, and we certainly can't change it today to accept new licenses. There's a bunch of insider discussion here, but I'm sure I will get yelled at for having this recorded on video. This is very similar to the big time license. It's a team in Germany that originally came up with it, and they felt very strongly that they didn't want to overload the term open source. And so they called it the fair source license. And they feel like the word fairness made a lot of sense and explained it to the people. Again, preserving the ability to charge for software. Well, nothing about an open source license takes away your ability to charge, which is another nuance. Sometimes we over worry about an audience that literally doesn't care about what license the software is, but they may feel very strongly about supporting maintainers or paying for software they use. So I think that's something else to kind of bring up. So specifically, both Nick and Eduardo, regardless of the license that you choose, what you sell or what your business model is can be radically different. And if your thought process is like, oh, if it's open source, no one will pay me. It totally depends on how you deliver the software and what you're selling aside from the software. Support, maintenance, being allowed to file issues, being allowed to file feature requests, some other things like that. I'm going to keep flipping. This one's really interesting. I don't know how much it's actually used. Was interesting to me because I feel like outside of the Western world, there still is a very loose understanding of both IP and open source. Basically, this is saying many software companies in China have a work schedule of 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days per week. So very, I would kind of call this an ethical license in some ways. And basically what it says, if you use this work schedule, your company is not allowed to use this software. So it's an exclusionary license. Go ahead, Danny.
So I don't want to, hello everyone. I don't want to kind of derail this, but I feel that Boris asked me here for a reason. So, and also I have to run off at 10 o'clock. Boris, is this the right moment to insert my RMS like patter, or do you want me to do it at the? I have to go before.
Go for it,
so.
Please.
Okay,
please.
Okay. I'm going to just drop this in because I think it's something that I got from sort of talking to people from the very early days of free software, stroke open source. And it really changed my thinking about all of these things. And I think like I've been watching all these slides going, yes, but, oh yeah. And I want to try and deliver it with the proviso that probably I should go and talk to the people who are actually perfectly well and alive, thought of all of these things in the 70s, but they're not dead, right? I'm not trying to reverse engineer this. I think part of the problem is some of them won't talk to me anymore. But let me give you the shtick, right? Which is, I was talking to Bruce DeKale and a few other people about the early days, 1980s, the construction of the GPL by Richard Stallman. And Bruce DeKale, who runs the Internet Archive and has a long history in this space, said, well, the thing you have to realize is that the very idea that software was copyrightable or intellectual property in any way was a novel idea, which is to say that all the way through the 1970s and before, it was the legal status of software in particular being something that you could say I've copyrighted was not defined, right? There was a lot of different legal questions about it. if you want to think about a way, if that's a conceptual struggle where you go, well, it's obvious, like you can copyright writing, why can't you copyright like software code, right? It's because it's a mechanical description, right? It's like you're just sort of spelling out a way that something mechanically works, and actually the application of intellectual property to those sort of mechanical descriptions is either unclear, or you shunt it off into somewhere like patents or design patent. It's not as clear cut as we think it is now. So what happened in that period is you had like environments like the MIT Media Lab and other places where people were cooperating and sharing code in a very novel way, right? In a way of not just in a sort of academic, oh, I'm doing this and you'll do this, but also this is the early beginnings of the idea of interoperable objects or systems that connected together, right? So you also have this idea of the perimeters of APIs, also this model, this sort of Smalltalkian model that we will have, that the software space will be these objects, right? And we will trade objects, and we will talk to objects, and the perimeters of where those objects are is not sort of super clearly defined. And the question about whether how those objects should be opaque to one another, right? Like if you imagine a world in which the definition of API was much vaguer, like how is this gonna like pan out? And then what you had is a push, perceived as a somewhat commercial push, understandably, right? To copyright and lock down these things. Most famously, Bill Gates's letter to developers in, I think, 76, where he's going, stop copying the BASIC I wrote, because people were taking it and it was on paper tape and they were just making copies, right? And people going, but it's not copyrighted, and it's a thing that we all sort of contributed to. What's going on here? Then cut to 1984, I believe. No, 1980. 76 to 80. 1976, a law was passed, a copyright law, bad in a lot of ways, right? Forget the name of it. That sort of in its wording kind of went, oh yeah, and software is copyrighted. And then some cases ending, I think, with the Apple v. Franklin case in roundabout 1984. I'm not a lawyer. I just spend too much time with them. And basically went, yeah, copyright, software's now copyrighted. The whole world changes. So after this history lesson, the key thing here is what was happening at the beginning of, in particular, using licenses to defend the idea of freely copyable and transferable and shareable software, was that it was literally a hack. It was an Aikido move, right? Like, and if you think about what Stallman is like, and you think about that community in that sort of like, oh, we've worked out this way of like totally turning everything inside out, and like we could use this sort of way in what then was probably fun and sometimes now is kind of annoying, at the very least. The idea is like, oh, we've created a copyright license that undoes copyright. So the fundamental idea of the GPL in particular, but also kind of the permissive licenses, was to kind of undo the spell, right? It's one of the reasons why the copyleft, right? It's like, oh, you're doing this incantation to lock down my software, right? I'm gonna undo that incantation, man. And I think it's a really important perspective, because I think it explains sometimes why things that would seem to be reasonable applications of this process get so much pushback, often intuitively, and also cause so many problems, right? So an example being, right, like non-commercial versus commercial, right? You go, okay, this is pretty straightforward. We just want these people to have the benefits of free software in the same way as only people who share their changes get the benefits of free software, right? We just don't want commercial people to. The counter argument to that is that's kind of the point, right? Like, we're trying to undo the very idea of intellectual property here. If you sort of go, oh yeah, but we don't want these people, we want intellectual property to sort of kick in for these people, you're going, okay, we built a gun that could only shoot guns, right? Like, we don't like guns, but we created this magical gun that can only shoot guns. You can't say, oh, it only shoots guns and people right, that we don't like, right? Like, you've kind of reinvented the problem.
Who gets to decide?
Well, it's not even that, right? It's like, we did this little tweak. We did this very confined thing where we tried to use copyright, this thing that we hate, to at least try and create a space where copyright could not exist, right? So every time you try and use it in a different way, it's like you're expanding a power that we are particularly determined to avoid. And like, I'll shut up, but like, my extra point here is that I think this also highlights two of the big challenges here. One is every time you try and use licenses to solve a particular problem in this space, you're using copyright, and that's fine because most people don't actually mind copyright. I mean, don't have opinions on it, right? Like, that's almost orthogonal now to the idea of open source, except that those problems still exist, right? And one of them is that it's a really, copyright in particular does not map very well to the usages and benefits of software, right? Because copyright is an attempt to limit the copying of things, to create an artificial scarcity in copying so that you can get some social benefits, right? And
Yes,
that is
yes.
not so bad with books or films or stuff like that, but it's kind of broken when you think about digital artifacts in particular and software in particular. So there's that, right? Like, so we can have a big discussion about that. The second part of it, though, is that when people are sort of struggling to work out ways of making money in an open source environment, like, it's sort of trying to fix it at the wrong level. Because fundamentally the problem is, well, okay, you get rid of copyright and intellectual property in general in software, how the hell do you make money, right? Like, that's, and of course, that's the reason why we have copyright and intellectual property, at least in the American model of thinking about things, which is it to create a revenue stream to incentivize people to create more works, right? It's not a fundamental human right. It's not a property right. It's sort of a thing that we built so that people who made stuff that was easily transferable in that way, that wasn't like a rivalrous good, could make some money, right? Like, could get some revenue. And not having copyright causes that problem, right? And we've come up with lots of different solutions, and maybe they don't work quite as well as we want them to. But if you try and go, okay, we're going to solve the revenue thing by using open source licenses, there's always a risk that you're kind of trying to solve the problem at the wrong space, right? We have this one very narrow solution that copyright worked for, which is limiting the damages that of the impetus mismatch between copyright and software. And so if you try and solve other problems using copyright in that space, you either hit the problems that copyright causes in that space, or you actually kind of fail because you're not really doing copyright properly, right? You're like going, oh, we'll modify this a bit so we can make some money. You're like, if you want to make money, just use a proprietary license, because that's, and you go, well, there are all these problems. You go, yeah, that's the problems with having a revenue model based on copying in this environment. We're kind of back to square one here. So anyway, this is like weird, mind-blowing conversation I had with a bunch of people that I've never seen kind of really written down, but has really informed my thinking about this whole space. And that is why Boris pulled me out of my sick bed to come and say this today.
Thank you, Danny. I think there's a meta narrative here where my hypothesis is that because open source is no longer a radical act and has become the water is wet that emerging developers swim in, we no longer discuss or engage with these topics at all. And in some ways, we're going back and tinkering with some of these things without really engaging with all of these thoughts. We have, right? And I think this is where Eduardo said both tragedy commons and post open source. Yeah, exactly. Amazing. So I'm actually going to flip back. Danny, thank you so much. And I'm glad we captured that. I'm gonna flip up my screen here again. So this is something that I had later on in the deck, which Danny has done a much better job. So there's a bunch of discussion, especially in Web3, that state violence, who gets to pick the copyright regime, the legal regime, and everything else like that, is that both copyright and copyleft are at this layer. And that in fact, what we maybe should be looking at is shared incentives in a governance model. And this is the let me flip right now. What are we trying to solve? Right. So I think that Nick had a very succinct statement and a goal. I would like to be able to work on the software and support myself working on it full time. Amazing. In the US, so that you can cover healthcare and not assuming equivalency to a high-paying software job. That means you probably want to make 80 to 100K US a year. Let's round it and say 10K US a month, which, by the way, from a global perspective, is an absolutely enormous amount of money. One of the things I'm thinking about in a phrase that I use about can we make open source a job is if software developers in emerging countries, that is an amazing slip of the tongue. That is exactly what I'm afraid of. Might make $500 US per month. And that would be an amazing living and an amazing business for them. So of course, there's an extreme tension between software developers in emerging markets being super happy with $500 US a month, and in the US, Western world, somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000 US a month, being possibly in the range of things that like you could do. Anyone have thoughts on that? And Eduardo, you said tragedy of the commons, so I'd actually like you to expand on defining that in your own terms.
Yeah, I can maybe say something about before I answer your particular question right now.
Sure.
Maybe something about the previous issue of developers in the third world. I actually happen to be a software developer who lives in a third world country because I am a Dominican. My country is a developing country. I don't think, with regards to that, I think ultimately, all that matters is that whoever is doing the work, i.e. the open source developer, gets enough for them to be satisfied. I do not think, I'm not terribly concerned about some open source developers making more or less. I think I'm perfectly happy with the market dictating where the money flows. If somebody makes a very popular framework and they make a lot of money. I don't care if they're an American. I don't care if they're a privileged American or an unprivileged Indian, because there's having a market need. My main problem right now with when it comes to resources is software being incredibly useful and not getting resources because we got a very troublesome periodic situation. I think if we solve that first, the issue of redistribution for underprivileged people is going to be a far lesser issue because they're going to be getting something. And the question is going to be how much can they get instead of are they getting anything at all? Regarding the second question of Trial of the Commons, I'm not an economist or an expert on the subject, so I really cannot get too deep in that, but I can maybe speak a little bit about what I see. There is a bit of a problem with the open source issue, which is most open source projects are just projects of one maintainer or two maintainers. And when you get contributions by people, very often there are tiny contributions that don't really affect things that much. There is a mythology right now that open source is this collective effort and the community is coming together to develop the software. And then in practice, it doesn't happen. It happens maybe on a few projects where there's so many people using it that inevitably you're going to be getting a few freaks who really do want to contribute. But in most cases, that's not the case. And that doesn't mean that the projects in which you don't have a lot of contributions are not relevant. They can be very useful, but people, for whatever reason, don't contribute. And there are actually some very good reasons why people might not contribute. If you wrote a very small library that is very easy to grok in a very small amount of time, because we're talking about a few hundred lines of code, anybody can contribute. It's not difficult. I wrote a little binding to a Java library for working with graph databases several years ago. And when I stopped contributing to that, some developer from right now I'm blanking out on the particular company name, but it's actually like a very big consultancy company at the time. He came in and he was like, "Hey man, can I maintain it?" And I just left it up to him. And it was a small library, so of course he could do it. But in my particular case, I'm developing a programming language. I'm talking about a code base of close to 200,000 lines of code, of very complex code that requires a lot of in-depth knowledge. I can have 1,000 people who are very enthusiastic to help out. Are they gonna make the investment in time to get themselves up to speed to contribute to that? And so the problem of Trial of the Commons isn't just a matter of people want to get something for free. It can also be a matter of people want to help, but the barrier to be able to help is so big that you are put in a position in which the only viable way to maintain the thing has to involve some kind of funding. Because you cannot just say, oh, the community is going to help, because maybe the community just doesn't have the free time to get themselves up to speed to a point where they can help. And so either you get the fundings you need to be able to maintain things on your own, or ideally, to also be able to give potential contributors the money so that they can dedicate the time, right? And so the way I see it, open source can remain a very viable model for a small projects where anybody can come in without a significant barrier to entry in terms of knowledge and expertise. But for larger projects, I think open source just isn't a good match. And I think that's one of the reasons why when we hear about these stories of maybe projects that used to be open source and now they want to go into a more restrictive category, they tend to be big projects like databases, for example. A database has the same issue as my programming language. How many people who would like to contribute to a database can put the investment in time to be able to enable themselves to do so? And even for smaller projects where anybody can come in, take for example the case of like Faker.js. I get the impression that the person involved in that makes a lot of libraries. So even if each individual one is small, they still end up with a very significant workload. And it's not like they can just pick someone else to become a co-maintainer to all of their projects. So I imagine that they may end up facing a similar situation. So I think the privacy of the commons the privacy of, the triad of the commons, the triad of the commons problem arises when you end up with this significant barrier to entry when it comes to maintenance. And that's definitely a problem that open source is not addressing, because it assumes that since the code is open, there are effectively no barriers to entry and anybody can contribute. And whenever that's not true, the problem kicks in.
Yes, I think I think one thing that I'm going to pick out of there. So for me, technically, the tragedy of the commons, one of the things that I've taken from that phrase recently is, in fact, the solution is in the book where that comes from, which is good fences make good neighbors. The tragedy is if you have no fences. This gets actually into some openness and some other things like that. And I want to very quickly go through this as a framework, because I think it's being used or somewhat more being used commonly, of talking about the problem and how ecosystems can do this. So this is a blog post from a couple years ago by Dries Buytaert, who's the founder and benevolent dictator of the Drupal open source CMS. And he has this grid here that's broadly used of whether something is rivalrous, non-rivalrous, excludable, non-excludable. So excludable meaning that there's fences around it. And a lot of the discussion around open source is that it is non-rivalrous and non-excludable. It's a public good. If you have some code somewhere, you can make as many copies as you want. Danny, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, see you later. Thank you. And that's the whole, like, it doesn't cost anything to copy the bits. Why should you charge for it? But I think what I want to bring into that is so part of this concept is Dries runs an open source company. And I think there's one nuance that he covers in there. So for end users, the projects, the code are public goods. There's no cost. There's no scarcity for making copies of the code. But and this is the company perspective. So if someone made a copy of Eduardo software or Nick software, they could make a copy, they could fork it, and they could get their own customers for it. So the rivalrous resource is the potential customers. That's a really interesting framing. And for me, the next part of this is that the real cost, the other rivalrous part, is if you let anyone post to the issue queue or post PRs or ask for support or ask for documentation or use part of the community, like, those are a bunch of the rivalrous costs where there's only one Nick and only one Eduardo available to do those things. So if there are more people asking for it, that's their limited time. So we can pick from that list which things don't get done. And I kind of put community in quotation marks, because if there's someone hanging around in a chat channel that might make you feel confident that you would want to use this software, that coordination and discussion around it also kind of has a cost. Does that resonate and perhaps illustrate what we actually mean of where the competition is?
Totally. I hadn't even thought about it from the angle that you mentioned of the rivalrousness comes from the customers. But I think that is a fantastic angle, because it actually reminds me of a preoccupation that I had. So for most of the time that I was developing my language, it had an open source license. And before I released the the last version, which was a very significant break from how I was doing things from the past, I thought, I may not necessarily make big changes in the future. So it will become like very easy for somebody to potentially fork my project and create a variant, because that variant is probably going to be very similar to whatever I make in the future. So if I am going to make a change in the license, I better make it now, because otherwise the forkability could destroy any capacity for me to monetize my project. And I wasn't explicitly thinking in terms of it's about the business, about the customers, but now that you mention explicitly, yeah, that's what it was. If you're in a position in which some user of yours can undermine your efforts for sustainable development, at that point, open source basically becomes a weapon wielded against you. And that's not a situation I think anybody wants to be in. And I am a firm believer in let's say, the spirit of open source. Okay, I'm not trying to destroy open source, I'm trying to patch it. But the fact that I am in a situation in which I have to worry that open source can be wielded against me, I think points to a very significant gap. And I think it's the gap that you mentioned.
So, but so maybe I can argue both sides of this, where a fork that doesn't include you, that doesn't include maintenance, that doesn't include documentation, that doesn't include support, that doesn't include community, doesn't matter. Like, what are you selling? What is the value? And the value is in fact all of those things. Yeah,
but I thought about it from the following angle. So I changed my life. I decided to start charging. Let's say that I remain with an open source license, so anybody can use Fork. But I decided I'm gonna charge for whatever reason. And then somebody says, I am a hobbyist. I really like Eduardo's technology. I do not mind maintaining it for free. And I'm a firm believer in the open source ethos. And I believe that Eduardo is making a big mistake by charging. So I'm gonna fork it, and we're gonna have a community version, and the community is gonna maintain it. Eduardo can charge if he wants. We don't care. We're gonna have basically like, OpenOffice? They made a LibreOffice, right? Because they had concerns with regards to licensing. I thought, what if somebody does that to me? But where the concern is not the licensing, the concern is that I'm charging, and they think that's antithetical to open source, so they're gonna make their own community version. You could say, well, your own original version, Eduardo, can be so much better than the other one, and you cannot compete them. But I think there are two problems there. First problem is, why the hell should I be out competing my own product? Because they're fighting me with my own product. And second of all, how many more versions do I have to make until my product is so much better than the version they use for? So then I can justify paying. So that's what I meant by open source being wielded as a weapon. At that point, you're not just competing against your rivals, you're competing against yourself.
Yeah. I think unfortunately this goes right back around where you have to think about your business model and what you're selling. And I still maintain that is in fact separate from the license that you pick. A license that you pick possibly gives you different options. But I think that the people who don't want to do the right thing just will continue to not do the right thing. I think this is, for me, I think some of the things that I would like to see more of, and Quinn brought this up in the comments, where Discourse, makers of open source forum software, they give a budget to all of their staff to contribute to open source projects that they support. That some of this actually needs to be movement building. Eduardo or Nick's license has nothing in it that says I have to pay, but I should pay because I want to continue to be able to rely on it. Or again, if we think about who the challenge is with, if it is a large entity that is concerned that software that they rely on continues to be maintained, to your point about, someone else needing to get up to speed and so on, there is a simple solution, which is a paid support contract. If you want a business model of selling support contracts to companies, you're still not selling the software. You're technically selling your time. Nick, do you have any thoughts on your business model?
Yeah, I mean, I have a million thoughts on my business model, and I can't decide what's the right move. It's really interesting. I think you're right that, well, it's interesting. This is new for me, and I'm still trying to get my head around it. But you just said that, the value is in the community, the movement, the kind of like a lot of stuff that surrounds the actual open source code, the actual open source project. So even to Eduardo's example, like maybe some subset of your community could fork your project and try to take it and run with it and compete with you. But unless they pull, kind of all of this outer ring of value away from your project, it's not going to go anywhere necessarily. It's not going to be a major competitor, which I think makes a ton of sense. But it's that this is where I'm like struggling to get my head around it. It's like, yeah, that does make sense. But also the thing that I've poured so much time into so far is the software, which is it feels like, I think it feels like that is valuable, and that is a fair, it's fair to ask for payment from commercial entities using the software in that case. But yeah, I don't know. There's a lot. I feel like there's a lot of options in this space, and I'm trying to get my head around the options space, if you will.
Go ahead, Eduardo, please.
About what you said about the distinction between licensing model versus, let's say, means of commercialization. I do agree that in principle, they are not necessarily strongly related, and you can have some a variety of choice of how you commercialize given any given open source license. But I do believe that I think we need to be careful with this notion that it's fine. I'm not saying this is what you were saying, but this is definitely something that I have heard from others, which will be like an extreme version of what you were mentioning of, well, you can make a living selling other things and the code can still be open source. I have one particular problem with that approach, because while it is true in any strict sense, I think there is a problem that it doesn't take into account the fact that ultimately, if you're dealing with a project that has a limited, usually small number of maintainers, maybe even one, you're dealing with a person that has a limited amount of time. And any time that they dedicate to providing services or products that are not related to the core project is time that has been taken away from the core project. So if I sell consultancy, every hour of consultancy is an hour that I'm not programming. It's an hour that I'm not fixing bugs. It's an hour that I'm not engaging with the community. And so I think it can be dangerous. And again, I'm not saying this is what you're saying, but I heard it from other people who seem to be very serious about this idea of, oh, you sell consultancy. Oh, okay. So you're basically operating under the assumption that I'm either the multiplying man and I can both do open source and deal with the consultancy, or you think that the software is so stable that it doesn't really require further development, so it's fine if I just make my living through consultancy. And I don't think.
So I agree with you, and I think the nuance is, so again, what we're talking about is that maintainer time is rivalrous. It literally, it's finite. And so if you're going off and doing things, you're selling things other than maintenance. So again, I think when I'm saying selling consulting, I encourage people to think about this and I think this is an emerging way. We don't have good patterns for this. Is what you're selling is an expectation that there is that what the company is buying is maintenance and updates of the software. That it's not a separate activity that they're buying. I don't have an example in the wild, and maybe this is the thing, but I think that's it. Go ahead, Jeff, please.
I have one. So CodeMirror is a widget that lets you write code in browsers, and it's used in everything. And Moraine Haverbeek is the maintainer of that. And as an example of how this works, because it was something we shipped in Firefox Developer Tools, it's a core part of the product. We had a maintenance contract with them that was an annual contract that was 5 figures US dollars a year. And so did, I believe, Google. And so in this very, very small, weird niche where this one person maintained a project, and most of what they did was like fix critical bugs that we needed to be, like, you can imagine like the security issues that would come in through the bug tracker for a browser that need to be fixed right away, that involved a code editor that executed live code in the context of the browser. So we needed him to be available to us to fix these things right away. He was the only person that could do it because he was the sole maintainer of the project. Essentially, we could have like an embedded engineer on our team that just worked on CodeMirror if he got hit by a bus or went away or didn't like us anymore. But that was the commercial relationship that we worked out in the real world, and it was very one-off. The source was all open source, so that wasn't the issue. It was the expertise and the availability of the expertise that we paid for. We paid a lot of money. So just as an example, hopefully that helps.
Yeah, so very specifically, he has a completely open source license, and what he says in here, I put it in the chat. I ask people and companies who use my software to make profit to fund the production of that software. This is a social expectation, not a legal requirement. Go ahead.
Can I jump in? I think that's a really interesting story. And I like understand that the maintainer would write that this is a social expectation, not a legal expectation. As a counterpoint, maybe to that story, and I think this also plays into why we're discussing value as the things around the project itself for some of this discussion. So I guess first the counterpoint, and then I'll come back to that. I've had an experience with a minorly, maybe less than minorly successful open source project where a big successful company reached out and they wanted to use this project, and we effectively started having a discussion around some kind of arrangement, just like Jeff, was it? Just like Jeff just shared. Sorry if I got your name wrong. And the conversation was really interesting because the company was expecting some amount, basically some level of time for free on the grounds that the project was open source. And so this conversation ended pretty quickly thereafter, and we never went anywhere with it. And that kind of brings me to, so I think on one hand, we have examples in the wild of companies like Google and whoever who are paying this open source maintainer for his time, et cetera. And then I think in the wild, we also have companies who see open source projects as with this expectation that it will be both free and maintained for free. And I think that kind of leads back to this discussing value as the things around the project. Because I wonder, just for the sake of discussion, like why, I agree that there is a lot of value in the things that surround the project, but I also wonder if, like, culturally we've kind of leaned into those things due to this kind of like, maybe these expectations that have arrived in open source. And I think this value around the core project, we're seeing it in a lot of different forms, right? Like there's a ton of businesses who show up who have a successful open source project like Vercel with Next.js. Next.js is totally open source, and what they sell, the way they make their money is by like, SaaS deployments and hosting and stuff. And I like, of course, that makes a lot of sense. But that's interesting because on its own, Next.js is a very valuable project. It saves people a lot of time. I think it would be fair for Vercel to say, you should pay for this. And of course, that's not their business model, and I understand, but it's interesting because if there is some sort of cultural expectation that has grown here, then projects that don't have a clear kind of like a clear SaaS model or a clear like, value or whatever, commercialization of the value surrounding the project, then the business path options, the business model options seem a lot more, tricky. You know what I mean?
I mean,
I want to just comment a bit about like, it really depends on the market environment that you're in, what the potential partners you're going to be dealing with, who your customers are, and what they're going to do. So in my example, Marijn Haverbeek was making a thing that browser vendors used, and all those browser vendors have like open source projects for their browsers. So it's kind of like there's an expectation of at least like high literacy around open source licenses and how that would work and how maintenance of software works in the open source field. You are in the area of in terms of audio software, much more proprietary culture and a different set of expectations around customers and projects and whatnot, and much lower literacy, juice aside, around and I guess elk, but like much lower literacy around how open source could benefit things, even though everybody in that environment uses open source at various levels, but the products tend to be proprietary and closed source. And so you've got a bunch of market and product oriented thinking to do, and the license, the open source license is sort of like should be chosen after thinking through that stuff. Does that make sense?
Definitely, and I think you are exactly right. Which is and I think that's been an interesting thing for my project, because there are I think there are plenty of people in my community so far who I guess maybe are more as you call it, open source license literate or familiar or whatever. Sure. And want to see an open source project. Yeah. I would love to have an open source project like that. If I can make these things work out, that's ideal. Yeah. But right, that's a very interesting conversation to have with, potential customers who are deriving real commercial value from this in a space where most things are proprietary. You know what I mean?
I think one of the things to consider, and this is really resonated from Kyle Mitchell, is again the concept of customer discovery and being very clear. So, as an example, you can put code up on GitHub or any other source hosting and make the source available. And in a license file, say, currently this source is available so that you can look at what I'm building. It's copyright me, and I'm working on a path to build a business around it. If you're interested in licensing terms for either open or commercial purposes, call me. and an email address or form to get in touch. So you can literally not license it, keep it fully copyrighted and proprietary, still make the source available, and literally see who will contact you.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I have basically thus far, well, tried a few things, but thus far the code has been closed source, and that invitation is kind of there, like, you know, reach out and let's talk, which has worked. Like, I have had this conversation with several people, many people, but
Great.
I think that to your point, I have this strong suspicion that if I open sourced the project, those conversations would be, you know, way more frequent.
Right. And this is one of those things where you can make source available without giving up all license and copyrights to it.
I think that's also an interesting, sorry, last piece. I think that's also an interesting conversation, especially in the niche that I'm in, because of how much of the software in this space is proprietary and closed source. There's a lot of, you know, trade secret concerns and things like that. And so I've had some interesting conversations as well around this, where you can put the software online on GitHub, but, you know, just as you say, keep all the rights to it. But if you have sort of a novel idea in your software, nothing's preventing somebody from going and taking the idea, right? And so that,
you know, at this point, we're right back to some interesting things about, like, literally what are protectable ideas in businesses. So this is a classic story that I hear in advising startups all the time. They're like, I have this idea, but I'm not going to tell you about it. I'm like, cool, then I can't really give you feedback on it. So, like, good luck.
Right.
I totally get it, right? Like, these are not all the same thing at the end of the days. And I think maybe some of the nuance around a bunch of these things as well is because of the extreme value of many digital companies and the opportunity cost of what software engineers can earn. There's an intuition that shouldn't this pile of software have much larger, like, dollars attached to it? Where on the flip side, if we were talking about this in the concept of art, then we'd joke and say, or music, haha, starving artist. So there's maybe some nuances around that, and thinking about, as software builders, are we artist creators and might want to adjust our thinking of what we can earn from that perspective? Or do we want to put in the work to build a commercial business around the software that we create? And what do we sell? And maybe, you know, what Jeff shared is an example of literally just an expectation that someone should get paid that isn't encoded in the license at all. I think we're almost at time anyway, so I'm going to say thank you. Really amazing discussion. Eduardo and Nick, you're in a room full of the Fission team. It was really amazing for you to come and talk about what you're talking about. We'll share the video. We'll put up links in the forum. Thank you everyone for participating.